Chapter 5, Section 2, Feudalism, a System for Living. Have you ever ridden a local bus, or have you ever used public parks? If so, you have used services provided by your local government. Do you think your community does a good job providing services that people need? Why, or why not? Questions to explore and think about during this section, and ones you should definitely be able to answer by the time this section is over, is how did feudalism protect people during the dangerous times of the early Middle Ages? And what was life like on a medieval manor? Key terms you'll come across and will be defined for you on the Google Classroom are Middle Ages, medieval, feudalism, vassal, manor, self-sufficient, serf. Key people you will encounter in this video and in Chapter 5, Section 2 are Charlemagne, and a very important place is Gaul, G-A-U-L, Gaul. As darkness fell, a young man prepared for a special ceremony. The next day he would stop being a squire or a knight in training and become a real knight. It was a big step up in life. The squire put on a white tunic and a red and black cloaks. Then he walked to the church, where he spent the night alone praying. The next morning he entered the castle courtyard, where knights and ladies had gathered. His lord presented him with his sword, spurs, and shield. The squire knelt. Then he felt the lord's sword lightly tap him on each shoulder. "In the name of God, Saint Michael and Saint George, I call you a knight," declared the Lord. "Be loyal, be brave, and always be true." The young man had become a knight and an important person in Europe, in a European society. Before all else, a knight was expected to be loyal and true to the lord who knighted him. His lord, in turn, was loyal to a more powerful lord. That lord might be loyal to a king. 1,000 years ago, governments in Europe depended on each person's loyalty to those who had more land and more wealth. Each knight and lord who was also supposed to watch over the people in his care, who were less powerful. Medieval times. This kind of government came about because it filled the needs of communities for protection during the Middle Ages. What are the Middle Ages? Historians usually say that ancient times lasted from about AD 500, all right, and they say that modern times actually started about 1500 AD. So the time from 500 AD, when ancient times ended, and the year 1500 when modern times begin, these years in the middle between ancient and modern times are called Middle Ages. This part of history is sometimes called medieval times. Medieval simply means from the Middle Ages. The collapse of the Roman Empire. In ancient times, the Roman Empire protected much of Western Europe. When it no longer had an army strong enough to defend its borders, the empire became weaker. In wave after wave, invaders claimed parts of the empire. They destroyed towns and cut off trade routes. They kept their own languages and laws. By doing this, the invaders broke the bonds that had held the Roman Empire together. Even reading and writing were in danger of vanishing, because many invading groups could not do it either. A quick map study, you'll see at the height of its power, the Roman Empire included the lands around the Mediterranean Sea and much of Western Europe. In the late AD 200s, the emperor divided it to make it easier. If you recall, that emperor was Diocletian. The western part went into decline. From the 300s to the 500s, peoples from northern and eastern Europe invaded and took control of much of the Western Empire. Charlemagne's Empire. As time went on, the invading groups set up small kingdoms throughout Europe. One group, The Franks claimed an area called Gaul, which is now the country of present-day France. In 768, a skilled military leader named Charlemagne became king of the Franks. He soon expanded his kingdom into an empire by conquering much of Western Europe. During his rule of more than 45 years, Charlemagne worked to keep Western Europe united. He also established schools to promote learning and culture, and the rulers who came after Charlemagne were weak. They could not defend his empire against new waves of invasion. By the end of the 800s, Charlemagne's empire had fallen apart. Feudalism, a basis for government. Perhaps the fiercest attacks against Charlemagne's empire were made by the Vikings. These tough warriors came from northern Europe, where Denmark, Sweden, and Norway are now. Their attacks began around 800 AD or CE and continued for about 300 years. Relying on surprise, the Vikings looted towns and murdered the people living in them. The people of Europe had to find a way to defend themselves against the Vikings. Slowly, they worked out a new system of government that could protect small towns and entire kingdoms. Creating order. The medieval power system was constructed like a pyramid. The people at the top of the system had the most power. They were kings and queens. Next in power were nobles, then knights, and finally peasants. This system is called feudalism. In medieval Europe, power belonged to those who controlled the land. A landowner gave a share of land called a fief to another man who promised to be loyal to the landowner, to follow his laws, and to fight for him. In this system, the landowner was called a lord, and the man who promised to be loyal to him was his vassal. A vassal could also be a lord. However, he had much less power than the great lord as whom he swore loyalty. The agreement between lord and vassal was begun in a solemn ceremony. Like a knight, the vassal knelt before the lord and swore to be loyal. The lord, in turn, promised to treat the vassal with honor. Then the lord gave the vassal a handful of dirt or some other symbol of the fief he was to receive. Feudal duties. A lord's chief duty was to protect his vassals and their lands. If a vassal with young children died, the lord became the children's protector. The lord also asked his vassals' advice before making laws or going to war. At least they were supposed to. Vassals had other duties besides serving in the lord's army. When the lord called them, they had to appear at a special gathering called the Lord's Court. They also had to make special payments of money or goods to the lord when the oldest daughter married or when his oldest son became a knight. Women of the noble class also played an important part in feudal society. Like the men in her family, a noblewoman was often sent to friends or relatives for training. After her training was finished, she took her place as a lady of the household. She managed the household, performed necessary medical tasks, and supervised servants. When her husband or father was off fighting, she often served as lord of the manor. Peasants and manors. A lord might rule over one manor or many. A manor was a large estate that often included a village as well as farmlands inhabited by peasants. The manor was very important in the feudal system, since a lord depended on the wealth his manor provided. A complete community. This illustration shows the plan of a typical manor. The manor was governed by the lord. He made the rules and acted as a judge. He also chose officials to manage the farming and other daily work. Since the manor was often far from towns and villages, its residents had to be self-sufficient, or able to supply their own needs, including food, shelter, and clothing. While most peasants were farm laborers, the manor could also have a carpenter, a shoemaker, a metal worker called a smith, that's where the term blacksmith comes from, and other skilled workers. The most important building on a manor was the lord's house, or the manor house. It was surrounded by a fence or a wall for protection. Beyond the lord's house lay the village. It consisted of a church, peasants' homes, a blacksmith shop, a mill for grinding grain into flour used for baking, and other workplaces. The fields outside the village where crops were grown were part of the manor too. A manor usually had 3 fields for growing crops. 2 fields were planted with crops, and 1 field lay fallow, or that means unplanted. Fields were divided into long, narrow strips. Some belonged to the lord, some were owned by the church, and the rest were divided among the peasants. The manor house was set off from the rest of the village and surrounded by a wall or a fence. In times of trouble, villagers took shelter behind these manor house defenses. The grain mill was driven by a wheel turned by the flowing water of streams. Sometimes the mill housed the village oven, where all the villagers baked their bread. The lives of the peasants and the serfs. The peasants did all the labor on the manor. They farmed the lord's fields to raise food for his household, and in return each peasant family could farm a small strip of land for itself. However, the family still owed the lord part of the fall harvest. Peasants lived in one-room huts with just a single window. For heat and cooking, they built a fire on the dirt floor. Without a chimney, smoke filled the dark, cramped interior before drifting out of the hole in the roof. In most cases, peasants were serfs. This means that they belonged to the land. They were considered part of the manor on which they lived. When a noble was given a manor, its serfs became his. They could not marry or leave the manor without his agreement. Although serfs were property, they were not quite slaves. A serf who saved enough money to buy a plot of land could become a free peasant. A serf who escaped to a city and managed to live there for a year and a day without being caught also became free. As you will soon read, or see in the next video, custom had a big effect on medieval Europe.